This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
They've been waiting 36 years.
Cold case arrest tonight. This Marlboro man is facing charges in 4 sexual assaults dating back to the 80s. Good evening. I'm Keisha Grant.
And I'm Mike Heideck. Investigators say they cracked the case with something called genetic genealogy. NBC Connecticut's Jamie Ratliff has our top story.
And I imagine for 36 years, a lot of these 4 women looked over their shoulders because no one had ever been caught.
The man who raped 4 women in 1984 was only known as John Doe. After 36 years, the state's cold case unit arrested a suspect, 69-year-old Michael Sharp. And they say they did it with the help of genetic genealogy, which uses DNA to find relatives.
I think it's a total game changer for us. It's just another investigative tool.
Authorities say back then the victims lived in Bloomfield, Middletown, Windsor, and Rocky Hill. None knew the armed man who reportedly stayed in the homes for a long period of time, and all victims were blindfolded. Without genetic genealogy, investigators don't believe they ever would have found a suspect. Authorities say Sharp's DNA matches the suspect in all 4 sexual assaults. Investigators say Sharp is also the former CEO of Jamoke Academy in Hartford. He resigned in 2014 after it was discovered he never got a doctorate despite using the title. In a statement, his attorney says he's not had an opportunity to review the test results that allegedly link Mr. Sharp to these crimes, and that Sharp, like any other defendant, continues to enjoy a presumption of innocence. Prosecutor John Fahey says genetic genealogy gives hope to victims and their families that their cold case is solvable.
One said to me, when we told her we were getting close, that she goes, maybe I'll be able to sleep 3 hours instead of 2 hours now. And another one said it was the reason she never got married. And so, I don't think until you've been there as a victim or a victim's family that you can truly understand the devastating loss and that it never leaves you.
And Sharp is charged with 4 counts of kidnapping in the first degree with a firearm. The reason he is not charged with sexual assault, according to prosecutors, is that back in 1984, the statute of limitations for sexual assault was 5 years. In Rocky Hill, Jamie Ratliff, NBC Connecticut News.
What happened to men and women sent to prison for years for crimes they did not commit?
Tonight, 13 Investigates takes a close look at how Indiana is dealing with those wrongfully convicted. Ireland's Andrew Chapman was there as Christine Bunch fought for freedom. Now the reality of life on the outside after the injustice.
Release. Woo! Piper and Paxson revel in the sweet taste of freedom.
Oh, I know.
Reassuring words from a woman who really does know. In 2012, 13 Investigates was there when Christine Bunch was released. She served 17 years at the Indiana Women's Prison, convicted of arson and murder for a fire that killed her 3-year-old son, Tony.
What was your number? 966069. Never forget it.
But new evidence proved there was no crime. The ATF report used to convict Christine had been fabricated to say accelerants were found in Tony's bedroom when original reports showed there were no accelerants.
I have to figure out if I can do this. Can I make it? Can I live after everything that's happened?
Now, for the first time, Christine is talking to 13 Investigates about life on the outside. She's one of 37 wrongfully convicted in Indiana, robbed of their lives and financial stability. It means starting all over with nothing. No home, no work history, no money, or even an ID.
So I had to go get a prison ID to walk into the DMV and say, okay, this is me. I need an ID. I was just sitting there crying, and they're giving me a whole list of identification that I need. And thank goodness the manager walked over and he set down the newspaper, and my picture was on the front page, and he said, we know who she is. We need to help her with this.
At the county parole office, convicts can sign up for multiple services, but for decades, exonerees were not eligible.
It's heartbreaking that we as a society broke these people. We took everything from them, and then we just throw them out and say, go, live, rebuild your life.
Christine moved to Illinois to rebuild her life near Northwestern Center for Wrongful Conviction. There she worked at the university's Department of Spiritual and Religious Life and helped spark criminal justice reform in Wyoming before deciding to come home.
Oh, it looks like somebody just got out. 29 years in prison.
She started a not-for-profit to help exonerees. J for J, Just Is for Just Us.
Yes, something horrible happened here and I lost 17 years of my life, but this is my home.
This just can't happen ever again.
Last year, she spoke out about the injustices facing exonerees. Indiana lawmakers listened and established a new compensation fund. It awards exonerees $50,000 for each year spent behind bars and now provides some of the same services afforded to parolees.
It's enough to give somebody a jump start.
In Christine's case, the compensation could amount to about $850,000. That's if she's approved. According to the Indiana Criminal Justice Institute, Christine and at least 6 others are awaiting word on a state payout. The money would allow Christine to move out of her brother's home and into her own, but it won't make up for the intangible losses she suffered, like missing her second son, Trent, grow up. She was 6 months pregnant when she was convicted and gave birth to Trent in prison. He was 16 when she was released.
We have exonerees that are coming out. Their family's gone.
Christine had sought millions in a wrongful conviction lawsuit, but her case, like many others, was tossed out. Government employees and experts have immunity unless someone can prove malicious intent.
The man who changed that report died before I was released.
The 2 former Indiana State Fire Marshal investigators who created the arson narrative never explained their actions either or admitted to the egregious mistake.
And sometimes you get an apology.
Sometimes you don't.
Did you get one?
I've never gotten one.
Christine admits anger comes and goes.
There is no amount of money you can ever give me to make up for that, to make it better, to fix it, because it just can't be fixed.
She's simply determined to live a meaningful life and to help those who have been harmed by injustice to start over too. 35 states now have a range of compensation laws, anywhere from $5,000 up to $80,000 a year. Now, Indiana is one of 10 states adopting a rule of $50,000 per year, but only if exonerees have not received payouts from a lawsuit.
Sandra, from time to time we hear about much larger awards as the result of legal action. Is that rare?
Well, we hear, Scott, that for the most part, only about 1% of exonerees are impacted to get those types of rewards. Now, Kevin Richardson and the exonerated 5 won $41 million for their wrongful conviction in the Central Park assault case back in 1989. Richardson was just 14 years old when that ordeal began. We sat down with him to talk about what he has gone through and the reforms he would like to see. You can watch that entire interview at WTHR.com.
Interesting story. Sandra Chapman, thanks.
A lot of interesting stuff has happened in the true crime world as I'm moving home. And I'm not really trying to do a lot of banter, but I do want to point out some things of stuff we've covered. And the first and most interesting to me is we covered the Crystal Rogers case over in Kentucky, in Bardstown. There were remains found, and that was the whole reason we were covering it, is because those remains kicked off a ton of searches in some persons of interest who were theoretically the only persons of interest in that case. And what's bizarre about it is this is all related to Crystal Rogers, except the remains are not Crystal Rogers. That's interesting to me that they found remains, and they're currently unidentified. They've been at the FBI for multiple months now.
It was August.
Okay, so it was right before we were doing the episodes. This summer, remains are found in Kentucky. The suspicion was they were Crystal Rogers, and they're not. And that to me is like,
recall saying something to the effect like, it has to be her. Like, who else is it going to be?
well, we looked through a bunch of, it's somebody that's not reported missing maybe, or somebody from somewhere else.
Right. And I guess just based on I know I watched something, and it just so like what I watched was not based on the remains being found. It was something that was made probably several years ago, and it just so happened that there was a piece, a follow-up piece at the exact same time I watched this rerun of something on a streaming service, and I thought that was interesting that, it's rare that you read about a story that happened several years ago, and you're watching something that was made several years ago. And then in current news, they're talking about a new discovery. And in this case, it was like, oh, they finally found her. I remember thinking like, oh yeah, there's no way that it's anybody else. It has to be her. And we talked about, the suspects in that case and everything that had happened. And then just like a day or two ago, very recently, they said, they were not hers.
Yeah, I was really shocked at that one. That was one of those, like, I'm not as obsessed with that case as I am with Israel Keys, but that area out there and some of that stuff that went on sort of surrounding her case that we had talked about, and it's certainly the mother-daughter case. Those cases every once in a while pop into my head and won't leave. I mean, I don't know. They don't ever really leave. It's just they're not really at the forefront because I've always thought they'd be solved once the sort of gang situation out there leveled itself out. I figured like Unsolved Mysteries or something would pick up those cases and sort of run with them and something would come out of it. But that hasn't happened so far. And everything that we've seen out of it doesn't seem to be coming to fruition. And that ties into a bunch of different little things. There's this hiker update I want to talk about briefly. This is Sherpa, Chris Fowler.
Yes, that's who we were talking about. And actually, I don't know how relevant he is to this case or to this episode. I just know we were going to do that.
Well, you know what? This doesn't really fit in with the episode that we're going to cover today, but we're going to kick off with
That's fine.
This. In the spring of 2016, there was this kid who was doing what's known as the Pacific Crest Trail, which is from Mexico to Canada. It's a hike that takes you through all sorts of varying terrain. You're basically going from, desert to snow. And on October 12th, somewhere in the area of White Pass up in Washington, he had less than 400 miles left to go, and he would be at the end of his journey. So Chris Fowler, who had come to be known as Sherpa, his stepmother, Sally, went on Dateline, and she basically says this was his thing. This was his adventure of a lifetime. And he knew that, like, if he didn't do it now, that, like, he didn't know when he was going to be able to do it. So he was 34 years old, and he went up to Cracker Barrel there. He had been on this hike for months, and he'd been picking up his packages and checking in with people. I think it was around 7 to 10 days that he had been checking in with his family every 7 days or every 2 weeks. This kid just vanishes within an hour of this Cracker Barrel. And his family they have sort of recently reached out through the Yakima County Sheriff's Office up there, and they're sort of pushing for people to bring forth information on him. So he disappeared. He was given a ride on October 12th, given a ride from picking up supplies in Packwood, Washington, up to the White Pass trailhead. He was dropped off there at a Cracker Barrel. Sergeant Briscoe, I think his name is Randy Briscoe, from the Yakima County Sheriff's Office, said that the clerk at the store saw him walk out of the store, and it's believed that he headed right back onto the trail. He's never been seen
and there was
again.
A big storm.
There was a huge winter storm that came through. He was headed basically into the last section of the trail and up into Canada. That pretty much everybody that was doing the same trail at that time left the trail. The big thing about it is an hour after he leaves this Cracker Barrel, this little store, and gets back on the trail, and Typhoon Songda had a winter storm come off of it, which was supposedly the biggest storm. The storm that hit in 2016 was like the biggest storm in 20, 25 years. When he made the decision to go down the trail, everybody thought it was a mistake. There was not really anybody there to talk him out of it. But an hour into his walk, his phone stops working.
Signal, right? Yeah.
His phone signal is no longer trackable. So if you have any information about Chris Fowler, the Yakima County Sheriffs, they want to hear from you. His family wants to hear from you. Just look up Chris Sherpa Fowler. He's a hiker. It would have been in Washington State by the Cracker Barrel off the Pacific Crest Trail. Now, your opinion is, you had a pretty strong opinion on this.
Right. My opinion is that probably within, stretch it to 2 hours, but he's somewhere within a 2-hour walk from the Cracker Barrel, and he could be, he'll probably have to be dug out, is my point. I imagine he succumbed to the elements. I think that's the logical thing. And I think that's sort of what his stepmother believes as well, because, everybody was hightailing it off the trail to get out of the storm. So I think in some of those situations, it's highly unlikely foul play is involved when the travelers are getting out because it's so bad. And he, unfortunately, there were several things that made me think that. For one thing, he was wearing sandals. He did not have appropriate gear because this was a snowstorm. Like, it was a bad storm. Yeah. And I feel like he just didn't know what he was getting into. I think that he could be easily found within, they say that his phone signal died and it never came back on an hour after he had left the Cracker Barrel. And so I feel like he probably, I don't know if he turned his phone off or, I don't know what happened there, but I have a feeling that within a paced walk, like you would walk into a storm, retracing his steps, you'd find him. Yeah.
So I'm with you. I think that's what happened to him. It's highly unlikely that, I don't think people think foul play. I think it's like a possibility in the back of someone's mind, but like realistically, I think they're looking for people who might have been in the area at the time and just not realized they saw something significant, and they just like to hear from them. They had some false sightings that put him a little further down the trail than it was possible for him to be, and they're really just hoping that a couple more people like that will come forward with information where they can narrow down a search for his final resting place right now. Temporary resting place, whatever how you want to say it. That case is less of an update, more of a request for information, but I wanted to put it in here because that's sort of an area that we cover a lot out there in Washington. And I just wanted to mention it in case some weird way somebody can share this and somebody else hears it. Because we get a lot of downloads on this thing, so you never know. Right. And actually 10 years earlier, he would have been a candidate for Israel Keys in my book. I would have crossed him out pretty quick, but that's why I noticed that story. Yeah, and so that's Chris Fowler. That's in Washington State. Anything related to October? So it's around October 12th, 2016. If you're in that area and you happen to see somebody on the trail that resembles him, I'll put a link to him in the show notes for people to check out. So I immediately went to CrimeCon, and that was interesting because I've never been to a CrimeCon before, but I got to talk to several different podcasters. I didn't get to talk to everybody that I wanted to, but it was interesting to observe how they interact with their fans. And there's a lot of really cool podcasters, and the way that a lot of them interact is, so I feel bad about one of the comments I made about, monetizing true crime is sort of awful. I don't think I'm going to do it. I've thought about it from the perspective of TV and documentaries and book deal stuff. I still don't know that it's the right thing to do, but I have a lot more respect for some of those people, and I have a lot less respect for some of those people because Nancy Grace was there and with a pre-recorded thing and whatever she was doing. Her situation, her story is tragic, but the personality that she has made herself out to be, for some reason, still grates on my nerves. And the crazy part is, I say that, but I also listen to her sometimes. I'm such a hypocrite because I'm sitting here listening to her rant. Well, I think a lot of people find her not
soothing, definitely not soothing. But, she does have a good story and she makes some good points. I know the delivery is harsh at times, and it's, I can sort of empathize with her. And believe it or not, I don't listen to her. So I just know, I just know of her from where she's sort of inserted in places. I don't specifically seek her out.
Right. And you pointed out something. I was sort of sharing with you the different CrimeCon stuff that was going on, because I was listening to Henry Lee at one point. He was talking about like the staircase. And then I was listening to Nancy Grace for a few minutes. You pointed out that like it's a character. They make these characters like Rush Limbaugh and Michael Savage and like, these radio personalities, even Howard Stern. They make these characters so that they sort of have plausible deniability in their own lives. And we didn't do that. Like, we made an error.
Well, I don't know how much it is of an error.
My point is, like, we're just us. We're just doing the things we always do.
Right. And actually, I liken it to what made me realize it was Mrs. Maisel, like on Prime, the comedian series. Did you watch that?
Oh, I love that.
And so the lady that is played by, my brain just went, it's right there on the edge of my brain.
It's about Jane Lynch?
What is it? Yes, Jane Lynch. So her character, she's a extraordinarily refined person, like the real person on the show, the character she plays. But then the character that Jane Lynch plays on the show plays like this old hillbilly woman as a comedian. Or do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah, she's doing like a mini Pearl act.
Right. And, Mrs. Maisel is so surprised when she meets with her, and she switches. I found that to be like relevant, because I was like, oh, that's how she puts herself out there like that, because she doesn't care what anybody thinks of her character, because it's not her. And Mrs. Maisel, of course, is completely herself, and she gets up and uses comedy from her own life. And so there's kind of there's something going on in that story. But anyway, my point is that I feel like Nancy Grace is that type of character. I'm sure she's a little like that in real life, or she's been like that at some point in her life, but she's probably way different. I do think it is a better option to put yourself out there, because, to get your ideas across and to be able to not care, I think it's a good way to do it through another character.
Right. And the other thing about, so this was like a podcast world for me to go to CrimeCon, and you don't listen to podcasts really. Like occasionally I'll convince you to listen to an episode, but it's never been your thing. So you're not basing what you do off of anything else that you see. You just created your side of it and you just go with it as you. And I think that's interesting.
Actually, I just talk about whatever you tell me to.
Right.
You say, let's do this today, and either I've learned enough about the particular subject that I can talk about it, or I haven't, and I have to go read about it real quick. But I feel like I go in like it's sort of like an educated conversation.
Well, yeah, like this episode, so we've got this 23andMe thing that came out earlier in the year. We've got a recording of us talking about it. We had some technical difficulties while I was moving home, and we were working all of that out. But that was just an interesting article. That was an interesting article that you brought to me.
So this is DNA that we're talking about, by the way. There's a whole host of DNA clips that have happened, like things that have happened in the last few weeks. So there's news clips available to use about weird DNA things. But this one's from March that you found a reprint of in Good Housekeeping. It's a really weird story.
I don't know what I was looking at, but it was a story about the mom of triplets submitting their DNA to figure out which of the two of them were identical twins and which was the fraternal. Well, I guess not identical twins, but two of them were identical and one was fraternal. When they submitted their DNA, the results were surprising. And so the mom, who was a twin herself, she also submitted her DNA. And they had, the mother, along with her sister, they had grown up thinking that they were of a Eastern European.
I thought it was Italian.
Italian, okay, yeah. An Italian, they were of Italian descent, and because that's what their father had always boasted about. So they were surprised when they had no Italian heritage in them. And so at first they hadn't opted into the DNA share, and they ended up opting in, and I'm not really sure exactly why they changed their mind, but as it turned out, there was another user in the database who was flagged as being related to them. And when they got in touch with them, they learned like the most incredible, crazy thing that you would expect to find out, having just wanted to know which two of your triplets were identical.
Right. So, yeah, Audrey Bell starts out. She's the mom, and she arranges for everybody's DNA to go into 23andMe.
From an article by Rachel Rifkin, reprinted in several sources. Two sisters took a DNA test. It revealed everything they knew about their family was wrong. It all started out innocently enough. In 2017, Audrey Bell, a 51-year-old mother of triplets from Long Island, hopped on the internet to purchase a 23andMe testing kit to help her figure out which of her triplets were the identical siblings and which was the fraternal sibling. But when she received the results weeks later, they revealed something curious. The testing was able to correctly identify which of her triplets was the fraternal sibling. But while their heritage was categorized as Southern European, the ancestry composition didn't mention anything specifically about Italy. That struck Bell as odd, since her father, Richard Palmadesso, had always been so proud of his Italian ancestry. She mentioned the results to her twin, Cynthia McFadden, her younger sister, Stephanie Palmadesso, and her parents, who were also confused about the lack of Italian ancestry. Still, no one thought much of it at the time. But at the end of 2019, Cynthia also decided to take a 23andMe test. Similarly, she was surprised to see that she had no Italian heritage. The sisters didn't know what to make of the results, and grew more suspect this time around. Their father had passed away in 2017, so by this point, they couldn't ask him any questions or have him take his own DNA test. So they turned to their father's closest known living relative, a first cousin who also happens to be named Richard Palmadesso, and asked him to take a DNA test as well. His results confirmed that the sisters were, in fact, not related to the Palmadesso family. Unlike Audrey, Cynthia had decided to select the option for 23andMe to reveal any DNA relative connections in their database. She had matched with a person named Tom Martin, so Audrey decided to go back to her profile and turn on DNA connections as well. Tom Martin also popped up as a match for her, saying the twins both shared 22% of their DNA with the man, which would make Tom either their grandfather or their uncle. The twins decided to reach out to Tom via 23andMe, and they soon learned that he was a 79-year-old retiree living in Florida who had decided to test his DNA for a very specific and unusual reason. He had been trying to find his missing younger brother, Gerald Jerry Martin, for decades. Tom told the sisters that on July 9, 1945, Jerry, just 2 days shy of his 4th birthday, was kidnapped while he and Tom, then 6, were out riding bikes together near their home in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of New York City. As Tom recalls, the brothers were approached by a woman offering them candy. Jerry went off with the woman to get the candy, and Tom waited with the bikes. Jerry never came back. Cynthia and Audrey wondered, could their father, who they knew all their lives as Richard Palmadesso, actually be Jerry Martin? Today, child kidnappings involving strangers are a rare occurrence in the United States, making up just about 1% of the cases that the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children worked on in 2019. But we can't be certain about the frequency or the details of any kidnappings that took place before the 1980s, when the 1983 Missing Children Assistance Act was created and a national registry was established for missing children. What we do know is that in the first half of the 20th century, There are plenty of infant and child abductions, mostly for the purposes of black market adoption, but also directly by women who wanted to be mothers but couldn't become pregnant for one reason or another. Whether there had been a national database at the time or not, it still would have been hard to put these incidents into numbers, because oftentimes people didn't discover that a kidnapping had occurred until decades later, if at all. With no DNA testing available at the time, families might not know that the children they raised were not biologically theirs for several reasons. A mistake could have been made at a hospital, or a kidnapping could have been covered up. But during the first half of the 20th century, a common kidnapper profile was a woman unable to have children who felt pressure from her partner or society to have one, often to maintain her relationship. There's been a profile about women who steal children to raise as their own among police departments since the 1920s, said Paula Fess, author of Kidnapped: Child Abduction in America, referring to a description of common psychological traits that law enforcement uses to categorize certain types of criminals. You can imagine that if they had a profile, then these were not isolated cases. With few job opportunities and other means of achieving financial independence, not to mention societal expectations and fear of domestic violence, these women didn't always feel like divorce was a good option, sometimes going as far as gaining weight to appear pregnant and buying new baby gear. They were known to steal infants from hospitals or homes. This was easier to accomplish back then than you might think. From the early 1900s to the 1940s, when hospital births were not as common, lax standards made it easier to snatch babies. Hospitals had also not yet developed standard procedures like ID bracelets for identifying mother and baby. Today, the disappearance of baby viewing rooms, policies that keep babies with their mothers, and strict security guidelines have made infant abductions and infant switches at hospitals rare. Birth certificates were also easy to fake before 1946, when the National Office of Vital Statistics began issuing and keeping track of them. Earlier birth certificates didn't have as much information as they do today, nor were they given to people born at home, and back then, home births still represented a large percent of all births. In fact, before World War II, up to 200,000 people were born in the United States every year that never got birth certificates. Around the same time, adoption became harder. After the 1940s, during the baby boom years, stigma around being an unwed mother lessened, and access to contraception and abortions increased. If you were a childless couple who wanted a child, you could adopt from a reputable adoption agency. But if you were unwilling to wait, or if you were rejected by an agency and had the money, you might turn to black market adoption agencies. Black market adoption agencies relied on pregnant unwed mothers who were often pressured or outright coerced into giving up their babies, or the agencies might turn to kidnapping. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, children were stolen by these adoption rings, Fass says. There was such a premium placed on having children that it was worthwhile for doctors to sacrifice their careers. They'd have the mothers, who were often young women and teenagers, sign their children over before they really knew what they were doing. According to Fass, if a person or couple wanted a child and could not afford a reputable adoption agency or even a third party to obtain a child for them, it's entirely possible that they might kidnap and raise a child as their own. In the past, the discovery of these kinds of kidnappings were rare, but with the proliferation of DNA tests, cases have become more common. Back in 1945, after Jerry's kidnapping, his father Harold filed a report with the local police station. The New York Daily News also wrote an article about the incident, which mentions that the police suspected that Tom and Jerry's biological mother, Nancy, had taken her younger son because she and Harold had recently gone through a contentious split. At that point, Harold was already with another woman, with whom he had a young daughter named Mary, one at the time. He would go on to have 2 more children with his second partner. But according to Mary and Tom, Nancy was never proven to have anything to do with Jerry's disappearance. Over the years, Harold, and eventually Tom, would check in with the local police station for breaks in the case, to no avail. The kidnapping hung over the whole family for decades. According to Mary, until the day Harold died, he was convinced that Jerry was out there somewhere, still alive. Suspecting that Richard Palmadesso was, in fact, the missing Jerry Martin, Cynthia asked her brother-in-law, who was in law enforcement, to look into the cold case. When he couldn't find the file, the family was told that it was possible it had been destroyed in a fire at the precinct. The New York Daily News article was one of only a few pieces of evidence the twins could find that revealed any details of the kidnapping. But as the women got to know Tom better, more similarities and clues popped up, backing up the DNA results. After exchanging photos, they discovered that Tom and Richard looked strikingly similar. When they met Tom in person for the first time, around Thanksgiving of 2019, they discovered the similarities didn't end there. The funny thing is that when we met our Uncle Tom, we found out he loves a lot of the same things our dad did, McFadden says. They both loved coconut cake and movies and acting. Uncle Tom even had some headshots from when he was younger and wanted to be an actor. So many things lined up, but the question remained, if Richard was Jerry, did the Palmadesso family know that he was kidnapped? What did they know? And who knew? According to his birth certificate, Richard Palmadesso was born in Staten Island on May 31st, 1943, to Isabel and Angelo Palmadesso. Until then, Isabel and Angelo did not have any children of their own together. But Isabel, who was in her 40s, already had 2 daughters in their 20s from a previous relationship. When Richard was 12, Isabel passed away, and Richard was sent to live with his uncle, Giacomo Jack Palmadesso, Angelo's brother. Richard stayed with his uncle's family until he graduated from high school, but he barely kept in contact with any family members after he moved out. Angelo died when Richard was 27. Richard's daughters knew that Angelo had served in World War II for approximately 2 years. Arriving home to Staten Island in September of 1945, they began to speculate that it was possible Isabel became pregnant right before or soon after Angelo left for the war and possibly miscarried, or for whatever reason, she had lied and told Angelo that she was pregnant. With the Nazi surrender to the Allies on May 7, 1945, and Angelo's impending return in sight, did Isabel realize she needed to produce a 2-year-old son for Angelo when he arrived home, and decided to kidnap Jerry? It was certainly possible. Unfortunately, there was no way for the sisters to prove their theory. While Isabel did appear to fit some elements of the profile of someone who would kidnap a child to raise as their own at the time, other pieces of the situation were out of step. What's unusual about this case is that the child was stolen at the age of 4, Fass says. Normally in these types of cases, the children are infants because the women want to make their husband think the child is theirs. But what was even harder to understand was how the situation might have been explained to little Jerry. If he had indeed been taken directly to the Palmadesso's home in Staten Island after being abducted from Manhattan, that he had a new name and new parents, that instead of turning 4, he was now 2. Today, Tom, Mary, Audrey, and Cynthia are in constant contact by phone, text, and Facebook. They celebrate each other's special occasions, even remotely for now, and the sisters share special memories of their dad with Tom and Mary. Earlier this year, Mary gifted Tom framed pictures of the time the sisters visited them in Florida. She gave them to him for Father's Day, since he never had any children of his own. Mary and Tommy are very warm and loving and have accepted us with open arms, Cynthia says. Still, for Audrey and Cynthia, it's been sad to find out that their father was kidnapped because he missed out on having brothers and sisters that he could have been very close with. Nancy and Harold had 5 children together, including Tom and Jerry. Even though there's still so many unanswered questions, learning about this kidnapping had given the women further insights into their dad. While he could be kind, funny, and silly, he also suffered from bipolar disorder and constant anxiety, and there was always a disconnect between him and the family that the twins could never understand. Now, it all made more sense as to why most of the Palmadesso family didn't keep in touch with Richard, and made little or no effort to get to know his wife and children. Tom seems to have gained some closure as well. He gets upset that they didn't find each other in time to meet again, but is happy knowing that my father had a family that loved and cared for him, Audrey says. He is certain that my dad is now finally back together with his real mother and father. If you know anything about Gerald Martin's kidnapping, or have discovered a non-family kidnapping like Gerald Martin's in your family, you can email Rachel Rifkin with more information. She's collecting stories like these at LifeStories Today, that's LIFESTORIES 2DAY, at gmail.com.
And then the next season of True Crime Excess is basically a bunch of different stuff that probably will dip into missing persons cases. And I've realized that I get a lot of the topics from our conversations. and things you send me, because like Israel Keys stuff keeps coming. Another podcaster that normally doesn't cover Israel Keys, they covered Israel Keys recently in sort of a, I'm going to read from these books kind of way. I'm not going to, it's not a podcaster I know, but I do listen to his stuff because sometimes he gets really interesting cases I've never heard of. For instance, I didn't realize that the two parks were actually separate in the Israel Keys case related to when he abducted Samantha Koenig. So I just found that out, and I started texting you, and you're like, I'm doing this other thing that you asked me about weeks ago that I sent you all this information on, meaning you sent me information. Okay, this is crazy, but that actually ties into the Crystal Rogers case. So there's this, like, in the lead up to this, the audio that I play at the beginning of the show, I'm talking about this old case of this guy, Michael Sharp. He just got busted recently for using a false PhD and booted from being like a person who was running a school, but his DNA caught up with him. So his DNA is linking him to all these 80s cases up in Connecticut. So he's like a miniature version of a serial rapist. I don't even know why I use all those words in the same sentence, but like so far they're just saying he's linked to all these old cold cases. So that came up in DNA. And you and I, when we were talking about the Crystal Rogers case, we were talking about like, did it give the cops an advantage, DNA or not? Because one of the brothers of the brother of the person of interest was a police officer there. And we were curious, like, would the DNA be something that linked them back to the crime? But it turns out there was no DNA evidence. They didn't have any there, and the remains they found aren't hers. So that kicked off like this spiraling thing where I was looking at the 23andMe article you sent me, and I thought that was interesting, clearing up an old kidnapping. And then we got to talking about like different serial killers and missing persons cases that sort of had resolutions that we thought we knew of. The first one that sort of came up on the list, I'm going to hold that back for a second because it's like our next little mini series that we're working on. But we were able to find like thousands and thousands of pages that, to my knowledge, they're released, but nobody's paying attention to what happened, because there's a California case in 1981. The boy's name is Jeffrey David Vargo. I say it like that bluntly because this is one of those cases that took years to identify one of the victims, to identify the perpetrator, and it really only started sort of coming together back in 2015. 2011, they started making matches in his slang. This is like a little boy, a little 11-year-old boy. There's a sex offender in California who had been committed to, believe it or not, an Idaho institution for violent predators named Kenneth Rasmussen. He ends up being connected to Jeffrey David Vargo and this little boy named Miguel. I'm going to like put some articles in here to sort of explain like what's been going on with this case and where it leads us.
From the Orange County Register, March 29, 2015. 33 years after Anaheim Hills boy was killed, a DNA match leads to an arrest. An Idaho man with a history of sex crimes has been arrested for the 1981 slaying of a 6-year-old Anaheim Hills boy found strangled at a Pomona construction site. After more than 3 decades, DNA testing linked the strangling death of Jeffrey David Vargo to Kenneth Rasmussen, a twice-convicted violent sexual predator, police said Saturday. Rasmussen is in custody at the Bonner County Jail in Sandpoint, Idaho, according to Pomona Police Lieutenant Eddie Vasquez. He is expected to be extradited back to Pomona, where he will face charges for the 6-year-old boy's murder. There was no word Saturday on whether Rasmussen will fight the extradition. We have mixed emotions, said Connie Vargo, Jeffrey's mother. After 33 years, someone is finally caught. This person took so much of our lives, and now he's been arrested. Hopefully, justice will be served so he can't hurt anyone else. Vargo said detectives informed her a few weeks ago about a person of interest in the case. and Rasmussen was arrested on Friday. To be honest with you, we're still in disbelief, she said. Things have come up in the past, and there have been leads which have gone nowhere. I don't know what to expect with this one. Rasmussen's lengthy criminal history includes at least 2 stays in a Southern California mental hospital. His first arrest occurred just months after Jeffrey's murder. He sexually assaulted an 11-year-old boy in Santa Barbara County and was sent to prison in December of 1981, then committed to the Atascadero State Hospital, according to Idaho sex offender records. He was released in 1985, then sent back to prison in 1987 for kidnapping and sexually assaulting a child in Los Angeles County. He returned to Atascadero after being paroled in 1996, then moved back to Santa Barbara after being released in 2007. The sheriff's office in Santa Barbara at the time warned residents of his presence and said in a news release that he'd be monitored all day, every day, by a GPS ankle bracelet. Rasmussen's relocation to Bonner County, Idaho in 2010 concerned many residents in the rural community. The Sandpoint-based newspaper, the Bonner County Daily Bee, reported he has no criminal history in Idaho. Initially, when he moved in, people were concerned about him, but we didn't have any law enforcement contacts with him, said Sergeant Derek Hagstrom of the Sandpoint Police Department. Idaho officials considered Rasmussen so dangerous they classified him as a violent sexual predator, the most restrictive classification in the Idaho Sex Offender Repository. Bob and Connie Vargo still live in the house in the same neighborhood where Jeffrey disappeared. Inside what Connie called a special box in their 2-story home are Jeffrey's favorite items: a bathrobe, slippers, and a collection of original Star Wars toys. Framed photographs of a smiling kid with floppy brown hair dot the house. These are the only reminders of their youngest son after he went missing while riding his bike around their quiet, manicured neighborhood on July 2nd, 1981, the start of the 4th of July celebration. The following day, police informed them that construction workers found Jeffrey strangled and partially clothed at a construction site in Phillips Ranch in Pomona, about 25 miles from Anaheim Hills. For 3 decades, the Vargos have always held out hope that police would eventually track down their son's killer. Jeffrey had just started the 1st grade, said Connie Vargo, a 68-year-old retiree. He was Daddy's little man, she said. He was so attached to Bob. He even looked like him, Connie said. They say the first kid always goes with his mother, so when Jeffrey came, he was Bob's. Jeffrey used to say to his dad, "When I grow old, I want to be just like you, and I'm going to change my name to Bob." "Don't you remember that, Bob?" she asked her husband. "Yep," Bob, 70, says with his eyes welling up. "Yes, I do." The first couple of years after his death were the toughest, Connie Vargo said. For at least 5 years, they kept Jeffrey's room upstairs intact, with a race car bedspread over his bed. They stopped celebrating the 4th of July, a painful reminder of what had happened. "Everyone is out celebrating with fireworks, but we always go away," Connie said. Milestones were tougher to handle. They watched their oldest son go through them, but not Jeffrey. Jeffrey never got to graduate from high school or fall in love. All of those things were taken away from us. And as the years turned into decades, that glimmer of hope to find a suspect became slimmer and slimmer. There was a lead in 1997, but nothing ever materialized. "You have to remember, when we lived in an age, there was no Amber Alert," said Bob, a retired supervisor for General Motors. There was no Megan's Law or video surveillance or internet. Heck, we didn't even have a VCR. There was even a time the Vargas lost hope. But Pomona Police Detective Jennifer Turpin, the lead investigator in the case, never did. "She told us to never give up," Connie said. "And look what's happened. It's a miracle. Miracles happened, and it happened to us." Connie said she hopes the arrest will finally allow them to heal. "We had another son to raise, and life goes on," Connie Vargo said. "It's been hard, but we always remember him." Today, the Vargos plan to visit Loma Vista Memorial Park, where Connie will have a pinwheel and plans to stick it on Jeffrey's burial site. "He would have turned 40 last year," Connie said. "But to me, he'll always be my 6-year-old boy."
Jeffrey David Vargo was someone I don't think people are going to readily recognize the name. And it's really interesting because he went missing on July 2nd, 1981. And it's very interesting the way that I learned about this case, because I was looking through the thousands upon thousands of files that were released in a very well-known missing child case. And in those records, the aunt, so the paternal aunt, Jeffrey David Vargo's father's sister wrote letters to this other little missing boy's mother. And that's how I learned about this case. All of the letters were in the police file for some reason. I don't know why. But, and so she was basically telling the aunt of Jeffrey David Vargo was telling the mom of the other missing little boy to stay strong, and she was giving her support and explaining what had happened. Jeffrey David Vargo was out on his bike and he went to go get some fireworks. He didn't come back home. They found his bike, and then his little body was found the next day. So he wasn't missing for very long. He was, they knew pretty quickly that he had been murdered. So, there was that, I don't even know how to put it. There was that, I guess, sense of relief as far as not, anticipating what had happened or, if they were going to find him alive or not. It went 33 years, which is just mind-blowing. Kenneth Rasmussen did something, he killed this little boy. He molested and dumped this child, and it caught up with him 33 years later, and it was due to DNA, which is absolutely amazing. But the reason, so it was interesting to me that I had kind of stumbled onto, I kid you not, 10,000 files. And I came across some random information of somebody just writing a mother of a victim a letter. I mean, she wrote several letters, I think, but it caught my attention. I looked up the case. It took a little while actually for me to find it because some of the parts of the files were redacted.
We were sort of like winding down the first year of True Crime XS, and we were still getting like the format under control and how we want to cover like one main case and then be able to do some miniseries. And I had two possibilities I really had wanted to look at, and I had mentioned them to Meg, and she went and started digging into one of them, and it was connected to all these other cases. One of the cases that it was like loosely connected to, we figured we'd kick off with that because it had been solved by DNA. And not only that case, but another case a little later, this little boy, Miguel Antero. And so Jeffrey David Vargo and Miguel Antero were killed by Kenneth Rasmussen. And what's interesting about his case, Kenneth's case, is it wasn't really solved till 2015, but he had been on everyone's radar for more than 10 years at that point. And the reason that he was on everyone's radar was because they didn't have any place to put him. So he wasn't the lead off for this series, but he was intertwined through these letters that had been sent to the parents of another victim by one of his victims. So he ends up, it's very anticlimactic. The gist of it is he's never getting out of prison, and they basically threatened him with a death penalty over the deaths of these other two children. But his case has this like sort of bizarre history that you have to take a look at. So, we'll talk about Miguel, and then we'll talk about Kenneth, and then we'll sort of get into why we were looking at these guys and what we uncovered in this other true crime case that has this huge legacy.
From the Daily Mail, on November 3rd, 2015, man who killed my son 30 years ago must face the death penalty. Father speaks out as sex murder of Miguel, 6, who vanished after school, is finally solved. Miguel Antero was excited to get home after a fun-filled day at school on a warm spring afternoon in 1986. But moments after the school bus dropped him off near his house, at an isolated canyon in Agoura Hills, California, the 6-year-old vanished. 7 hours later, the sweet and shy boy was found dead in nearby brush, his tiny, broken body covered in stab wounds. It was a murder that shocked America, devastated the Antero family, and set 2 determined detectives on a long path to bring his killer to justice. At the time, police had a prime suspect, convicted sex predator Kenneth Rasmussen, but with no hard evidence, the hunt went on, and for 3 agonizing decades the case remained cold. But last week, 53-year-old Rasmussen was charged with murder by the Los Angeles County District Attorney, accused of killing Miguel while performing a lewd or lascivious act. For the Antero family, a conviction will signal the end of 30 years of pain, but with mixed emotion. Miguel's father, Sankara Antero, told the Daily Mail online of Rasmussen's charge that the news was bittersweet. It was sweet because it was good to know that this animal who murdered my little boy is finally going to be brought to justice, he said. But it was bitter because it brought back the horror of losing Miguel. This thing, I won't call him a human being, not only destroyed my boy, he destroyed my whole family. He should get the death penalty, preferably with a great deal of torture. The charge, based on DNA evidence, came after police arrested Rasmussen earlier this year in Idaho in connection with an even older cold case, the 1981 kidnapping and killing of 6-year-old boy Jeffrey Vargo. Police say the first grader disappeared while bicycling in the neighborhood on July 2nd that year. His parents found his bicycle abandoned in an alley near a fireworks stand later that night. The following day, 2 construction workers found Jeffrey's body behind a pile of sand at a construction site about 25 miles away in Pomona, California. He had been strangled. Mr. Antero added, knowing that Miguel's killer has been caught does bring some closure, but it doesn't take away the pain of losing my son in such a horrible way. That is something I will never recover from until the day I die. Rasmussen might never have been linked to Miguel's murder if retired Sheriff Sergeant John Laurie, one of the original detectives assigned to the homicide investigation, hadn't been watching TV at his home in Orange County. The news show he was watching aired an item with a mugshot about Pomona police arresting Rasmussen in connection with Jeffrey Vargo's murder, and astonished Laurie immediately recognized the man in the mugshot as the same one who 28 years earlier he had suspected of killing Miguel Antero. But at that time, he couldn't find enough evidence to charge Rasmussen with murder. After the TV news show ran last March, Laurie, who retired from the Sheriff's Department 12 years ago, called LA County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit and asked them to dig out the dust-covered evidence files from Miguel's 1986 case. Take it to the lab and just run it through. I'm convinced this is our suspect, Laurie recalled telling a trusted investigator. A Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department senior criminalist who performed the lab work used the latest techniques and identified DNA evidence which connected Rasmussen to Miguel's murder. On October 22nd, Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office formally charged Rasmussen with the murder. The reason Detective Laurie had targeted Rasmussen as a suspect nearly 3 decades earlier was that on April 8, 1987, a year to the day after Miguel's killing, Rasmussen abducted a 3-year-old boy from a home in Los Angeles. He sexually abused him, then abandoned the naked child in the Agora area, not far from Miguel's home. A few days later, Rasmussen, who was 25 and living in Santa Barbara at the time, arrived with his parents at the LAPD to turn himself in. He pleaded guilty in court to kidnapping and molesting the toddler and was sentenced to the statutory maximum, 17 years in prison. Believing that the date of the second kidnapping, on the anniversary of Miguel's savage murder, was more than a coincidence, Laurie and his then partner, Detective Jack Fueglin, obtained a warrant to search Rasmussen's home, interviewed his neighbors, and even conducted a jailhouse interview, hoping for a confession. Instead, Rasmussen immediately invoked his right to an attorney, effectively ending the interview. The search of the home did unearth some evidence, but not enough to make a case. There were never any other suspects, Laurie told the LA Times, but we did not have enough to proceed. It was frustrating for the detectives, given sex predator Rasmussen's history. Following his first child sex crime conviction in 1981 for kidnapping, sodomizing, and orally copulating an 11-year-old Santa Barbara boy, he was sent to a Tuscadero State Hospital in 1982 after being declared a mentally disordered sex offender. He was released 2 years later and, according to records, was responding well to treatment and not viewed as likely as a danger to the health and safety of others. It was 2 years after his release from the hospital that Miguel's body was found in Agora Hills. And this time, Rasmussen had wandered through California, Oregon, and Washington state before settling in Idaho. A year after Miguel's death, Rasmussen was convicted for the kidnap and molestation of the 3-year-old boy in L.A. Police eventually caught up with Rasmussen in the resort town of Sandpoint, Idaho, where he was living with his parents, and he was arrested on March 27th on suspicion of murdering Jeffrey Vargo in 1981. Prosecutors have not yet announced whether they will seek the death penalty in either case, but it is likely Rasmussen will be handed, at the very least, a life sentence if convicted. For the Antero family, they are 30 years in to their own life sentence. Miguel's tragic death instantly ended the cozy, idyllic family life the Anteros had once enjoyed. Father Sankara, his wife of 14 years, Anna, and Miguel's beloved oldest sister, Enid, then 11, were all distraught, and Miguel's passing tore their family unit apart. We were devastated, said Antero. Up till that point, my wife and I were happily married with 2 beautiful children. I had a good job. Things were great. Then Miguel was killed, and everything fell apart. Only a few months before, the Anteros had moved from Colorado to Agora Hills at the urging of family members who had settled there. They painted such a rosy picture that we decided to make the move to California, said Mr. Antero. I've been in the construction business, and I finished finished my architectural studies, got my contractor's license in California, and got a good new job building homes. Then, their little boy's lifeless body was found, and the Enteros began a downward spiral into a never-ending nightmare. Within 6 months, his marriage broke up. He lost his job. Unable to get past his grief, he ended up homeless. Our marriage just couldn't survive the sorrow of losing Miguel, he said. We were both so melancholy that we couldn't communicate. We tried therapy, but it didn't help. I guess we subconsciously blamed each other for what had happened, and we blamed ourselves. I was at work that day, so I wasn't at home. My wife would normally have been waiting at the bus stop for Miguel to take him home, but that day she had a doctor's appointment, and she was running a few minutes late, so when the bus arrived, Miguel got off, and he was left by himself. To this day, I get angry when I think of how that bus driver dropping Miguel off, leaving him by himself. That was wrong. It should never have happened. The other thing that still haunts me is that on the morning he died, I had driven him to school because he missed the bus. I remember almost saying to him that day, "Hey, why don't you take off school today and come to work with me instead?" But I didn't. I dropped him at school, and I've been beating myself up about that ever since. Despondent Mr. Entero, a U.S. Air Force veteran, spent the next years drifting from California to Colorado to Florida, taking work when he could get it in construction or even as a night watchman. He found it hard to keep a job, though, and the low point came for him when he was homeless for about a year. I was a zombie for years after Miguel's death, he said. It took him 2 decades to start getting back on his feet and find regular construction work in Colorado, where he now lives in Aurora. But he never remarried. He rarely talks to his daughter Enid or his ex-wife Anna. There's never a day that passes when I don't think of Miguel, he added. He was such a sweet boy, a joy to be around. My ex-wife thinks his killer should be put in jail for life, but I strongly disagree. He's not a human being. He deserves to die. As for Miguel's sister Enid, she too feels that Rasmussen, if convicted, should pay the ultimate price. The animal who murdered my little brother so callously and violently ripped his little body to shreds. He doesn't deserve to live. He should die a slow and painful death. When she heard that Rasmussen had been charged with Miguel's murder, she says, "I was shocked. I was completely shocked. My first reaction was disbelief. I had never expected this day to come. And I cried and I cried." From the Santa Barbara Independent, on December 1st, 2007, sexual offender released to Santa Barbara, but without a place to go. All of the difficulty that Kenneth Rasmussen has had trying to find a permanent address, one that is at least 2,000 feet from a school or park where children might congregate, raises the question, why bother? This past week, Rasmussen and the Liberty Healthcare agents who are assigned to guard him 24 hours of every day even traveled to Pendola Campground to see if the global positioning satellite ankle bracelet he must wear would work there. According to Sheriff's Department spokesperson Lieutenant Butch Arnoldy, Liberty Healthcare dropped that idea after it was pointed out to them that it's a good 2-hour response time for us, and also just due to ignorance on their part. Arnoldy continued, "You can just stay 14 days a year at public campgrounds." Rasmussen is not the first child molester to have a hard time finding lodging upon their release from prison. He is, however, the first officially designated SVP, or sexually violent predator, ever to be released into Santa Barbara County, distinguished from the dozens of other child molesters on the Megan's Law, South County databases by 2 things. One is the aggression and sadism of the crimes for which he is convicted, and the other is his status as a model patient in a Tescadero State Hospital sex offender treatment program. Rasmussen was first arrested at the age of 19 for the rape of an 11-year-old in Santa Barbara. According to a brief account in the news press on September 2nd, 1981, Rasmussen lured a boy into a gully near Las Positas Road, near the present site of Ellings Park, by asking his help in finding a lost dog, who, according to Rasmussen's pretense, was also deaf. The boy, who had been riding his bike on the way to football practice, was instead attacked and subjected to forcible oral copulation and sodomy. After the boy told his coach what had happened, Rasmussen, a worker at Domino's Pizza, was found still lurking near the Youth Football League fields. He served time in prison and in a Tescadero until April of 1985. The second crime, committed when Rasmussen was 25, almost 2 years to the day after his release, was the abduction and rape of a 3-year-old, who Rasmussen snatched off of a Los Angeles sidewalk and placed in his car while the toddler's sister, who had been watching her little brother, screamed. A passing motorist found the boy wandering naked the next morning in the Agora foothills near Cannon Road. He had been raped. 2 days later, in the company of his parents, Rasmussen turned himself in. That was on April 10th of 1987. He was sentenced to 17 years and served 20, and was granted release last December by the 2nd District Court of Appeal, which overturned Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Gus Gomez's refusal to do so. In mid-November, Rasmussen was transported to the Super 8 motel on Hollister Avenue, which remains his officially listed address. Motel management denies that Rasmussen is registered there. Under California's Sexually Violent Predators Act, first enacted in 1985 and amended several times since, a person designated SVP can be confined to a mental hospital indefinitely, even after they have served all of their prison time, until it is determined they are not likely to reoffend. The definition of likely, as discussed in the published opinion of the appeals court's justices, who decided to release Rasmussen, remains murky and subjective. The justices based their decision that Rasmussen did not present a substantial danger on the opinions of 8 psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers, 3 of whom were on the staff at Atascadero. These mental health experts cited his willingness, even eagerness, to take Lupron to reduce his sex drive to a level simulating castration, and his outstanding success in cognitive behavioral therapy, as well as his family support and his devotion to hobbies and intellectual interests. One Atascadero staff psychiatrist, Mary Flavin, noted that Rasmussen said he never felt more free in his life after he started taking the Lupron at her suggestion. She said it created a huge change in his personality, as if a huge load had been lifted from him. Even without the drug, she and others noted his arousal in response to stimulation depicting young boys, especially violent sexual encounters with young boys, had been diminished by the non-drug therapies in which he willingly participated. Flavin and others cited his honesty in confessing to other instances when he had molested children as evidence of his good faith efforts. Atascadero clinical psychologist Michael Pritchard noted that Rasmussen was one of only 6 patients at Atascadero out of 600 who were given the highest level of access, allowed to move freely throughout the hospital all day without having to check back into their unit. Forensic psychiatrist William Vickery assessed Rasmussen's likelihood of reoffending at 10 to 20%. However, Vickery and others also characterized the CONRAP conditional release program for SVPs as almost fail-safe because it involves not only drug monitoring but polygraph penile arousal testing and regimented daily routines. Rasmussen can be sent back to the hospital at the very first hint of a problem, according to clinical psychologist Harry Goldberg. On the other hand, Pritchard, Flavin, and the other experts cited such risk factors as Rasmussen's adeptness at manipulating people, as evidenced by the fact that he was considered a star patient the first time he was released from Atascadero in 1985, when the then director described him as no longer a danger. By Rasmussen's own account, he molested several children over the next 2 years, before he was arrested for raping the 3-year-old, all the while participating in individual and group therapy with apparent success documented. The experts noted that Rasmussen tended to assault children in response to stress or trauma, which would no doubt increase upon his release from the hospital, and that he had never had an intimate relationship with an adult. One of the 8 who testified, Dr. Jesus Padilla, a senior psychologist at Atascadero, said that according to an unpublished study he led, men taking Lupron were perfectly able to achieve erections in arousal tests, and he noted that furthermore, these drugs can be countered with testosterone and Viagra. He alone of the 8 experts who testified did not support Rasmussen's release, although he didn't oppose it either, according to the appeals court opinion. Against this weighty and impressive evidence, the justices opined the prosecution, which sought to keep Rasmussen locked up, failed to present a single scintilla of evidence that the appellant would re-offend. Superior Court Judge Gomez, moreover, had arbitrarily and without explanation disregarded those opinions, the ruling states. Given the reports of the experts, the justices wrote, to deny Rasmussen's petition was tantamount to concluding that no SVP who has ever committed a prior serious sexual offense, regardless of how long ago it occurred, can be conditionally released. Such a conclusion would present serious constitutional issues.
So that's Kenneth Rasmussen. And, obviously there's some sensitivity to dealing with stories with children, but that's the miniseries that we're kicking off here. And I've been debating, do we talk about who the main case is or not? And I don't think we're going to this week. I think we're talking about it next week. But it is all tied together. It all happens in relative period of time. If you listen to those dates, you probably have a good idea of who we're about to talk about. And that case will that'll be the last of either the last or the second to last miniseries that we'll cover in 2020.
From the IndyStar.com, on October 15th, 2020, she was wrongfully convicted and imprisoned. On Thursday, the state decided it owed her. A woman who spent 17 years in prison after being wrongfully convicted following a mobile home fire that killed her 3-year-old son will be financially compensated by the state of Indiana. Christine Bunch, who was convicted of murder and arson in 1996, was found on Thursday by the Indiana Criminal Justice Institute's Board of Trustees to be eligible for compensation through the state's exoneration fund. Jackson County Judge Amy Marie Travis, one of the board members, said there was clear and convincing evidence that Bunch had been innocent all along. Bunch struggled to hold back tears as the decision was announced at a state government building in downtown Indianapolis. "I won't ever get my day in court, but I got to hear it from these people here," she said. "That closes a chapter and gives me a different outlook on things because I feel like it's just been a black cloud that I've carried around." The Indiana Court of Appeals overturned her conviction in 2012 after it came to light that 2 investigators with the state fire marshal's office and an analyst with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives had fabricated evidence indicating that the 1995 fire at Bunch's mobile home in Decatur County was the result of arson. Bunch is one of 3 people whose applications for compensation were approved by the state since the Criminal Justice Institute's Board of Trustees began handing down decisions in September of this year. The Exoneration Fund, which was signed into law by Governor Eric Holcomb in June 2019, can award up to $50,000 for every year an individual was wrongfully incarcerated if there is strong evidence that the person was innocent of the crime and had no role in its planning or execution. The Criminal Justice Institute has received 15 applications for the Exoneration Fund to date. Bunch has not been told how much she will receive as part of the decision. Fran Watson, an attorney who leads the wrongful conviction clinic at Indiana University at Purdue, McKinney School of Law, said days like these give her hope that Indiana's Exoneration Fund can help correct errors of the past. "I'm very optimistic that this process is going to work in Indiana and that we're going to get results that are fair and provide justice for people deserving that justice," Watson said. Bunch said she was looking forward to celebrating the decision. "I'm going home to play with my puppies," she said. Thanks for joining us. You can reach us at 252-365-5593 or at truecrimexcess.com or truecrimexcess@gmail.com if you want to send us a note. This episode was brought to you by LabrotiCreations.com. That's LABROTTIECREATIONS.com. Check out the merchandise and specifically their fun Pop Pet art custom pieces made from photos of your very own pets. Use the promo code CRIMEXS, that's CRIMEXS, for 20% off a fun, brightly colored, happy piece of art of your own pet at their site, LabrotiCreations.com. Music in this episode was licensed for True Crime XS. The theme song was Indestructible by Noah Smith. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform or at TeePublic, Instagram, or Twitter. You can also join us on Patreon to fund future body exploration trips. But the best thing you can do for us is leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform and share us with your friends. And we'll see you next time.
This is True Crime XS.
Take these walls down, break shadow of what it used to be, and I think it's time to leave. Give me a reason and we'll leave it all behind. I wonder what we will find. Take these walls down, brick by brick for you. Build a new town. We can start out new. Take these walls down, brick by brick for you. Build a new town. We can start out new. Brick by brick for you. We can start out new. Brick by brick for you. We can start out new. Brick by brick for you. We can start out new. This place is a shadow of what